So today's topic is going to be on mythology and story writing, what it looks like, why do we do it, defining terms, what is myth, why is it important today? And then really what I'd like to jump into is the practical side of it, so people that are interested in making myths, storytelling, creating art, what does it look like today? And so I invited all of you guys to join because as Neil says, you guys are middle-class myth makers, as in you're sustainably and creatively getting your stuff out there in a way that is sustainable for your families and your livelihood.
I'm glad you didn't say like we were the bourgeois myth makers or something.
Yeah,
like that.
you're right. You're right. You gotta aim low.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as far as the hierarchy goes, it's like lopsided on one end or on the other. It's like there's a few people that are doing really, really well and are unattainable for a lot. And then there's a whole lot of people that are, striving to make it, but not making ends meet, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like you guys are just, you're right at that middle ground where it's like something that people can aspire to. And then it's not so far out of reach. You ask for advice for someone that has like 10 million subscribers on YouTube or has sold 30 books. And it might not be the best advice for people that are just starting out,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, no, that stops people
Yeah.
from giving opinions.
I think thinking about it as a middle class perspective is kind of an interesting thing too, because when I first started out in music, there was a larger middle class of music that basically evaporated when streaming hit and pirating music hit, and it became very difficult to make it sustainable. Simultaneously, everybody in the world was trying to put together a band and play free shows for clubs, and those paychecks were being taken away from smaller musicians. And so generally, when you refer to a middle-class musician now, you're referring to someone that has a side project and teaches lessons if they're doing music full-time. So I'm fortunate enough to have gotten ourselves into a position where that's not the case. And so I'm always happy to answer questions about, like what's the path there,
Yeah. Well, why don't we kick off this master class of mythology with a couple brief introductions. So why don't we start with Neil? Neil is a myth maker, musician, and recently movie maker, publishing Queen of the Night most recently, and a fantasy silent film. Nicholas Kotar is a fantasy author who is the author of the Raven Sun series, among many others, and is just wrapping up one heck of a Kickstarter, whose title is Yola Bokaflod. How to do on that, Nicholas?
Yeah, it's going well. It's going well. It's an experiment in trying out several different things, but I think we might want to talk about it a little bit later, especially if we want to get into the nitty gritty of how a creative in our world can make it. Both financially and creatively, because this is not just a cash grab or a money grab or an attempt to get people to contribute their hard-earned cash, but it's an attempt to try out something like a medieval patronage system, but with the advantages of modern internet. So I'll leave it there for now.
Interesting. How to do on the pronunciation of the Kickstarter?
I have no idea. I'm not Icelandic.
I love it.
Close enough, Derek.
Thanks, Richard. And Richard is the host of the Alman Sewell podcast, and I would consider an expert in Tolkien philosophy and Lord of the Rings, folklore, and world building. And he's also an author. Well, you can buy the Akboritha. Did I pronounce that correctly, Richard?
It's actually Akborida, but again, close enough.
All right. And and so he has a great general knowledge of mythology and myth making, but then also he has so many active projects, and we can get into that later. And I myself am going through kind of a transition of, how do you say it, like a person commenting on art as a movie critic or a video essayist or an essay writer for the symbolic world, and taking all of that knowledge and more transitioning over to creating original art, writing stories and music and concept records and fantasy and fiction and things of that nature. So I approached you guys really asking that question, today, what is myth? Because I look at all of the titles for like trending articles or even TV shows like Mythbusters or like the 21 myths about the starving artist. And then the way that term is used is really like this made up reality or made up stories that all of us believe. And it's like, the lie that we all tell ourselves, and that we need to, like, through the Enlightenment philosophy, like, come to the light and see things for facts and hard data, rather than these stories as if, you know, they don't have any meaning in themselves. And then you look at shows like Mythbusters, and the whole thing is like a bunch of scientists trying to disintegrate stories into more of a scientific term. So kind of using that to frame our conversation, maybe help people that really have no idea what we're talking about when we have more of this ancient perspective of myth. So Nicholas, why don't you start us off? What would you say myth is, and why is it important today?
Well, I'm no mythologist. I just try to tell stories, but it's interesting. It's a difficult question, because it is true that you have phrases like, you know, the writers of myths have faded away in the akathist to the Mother of God. So on the one hand, you know that the writers of myths are something that one should probably rejoice at them fading away, not call for them to come back. And there is a strong equation between fiction and myth in this kind of pejorative sense, not even in the pejorative sense that the world gives it, but in the pejorative sense that traditionalist orthodox give it. So there's a lot of definitions out there, and it's probably a good idea for us to come up with some standard definitions here, just to help people out. And as far as I can tell, I'm not going to say what it is, but I'll talk about what it evokes. When we talk about myth, we're talking about the kinds of stories that resonate on a much deeper level than the kinds of stories you find in most novels. So these are stories. They are about very large things. They're about life, death, creation, cosmic realities. They have their own rules. They have their own logic. They are told in a specific way. Those rules and logic don't really follow storytelling in a modern sense. They work in a different level, and they tend to be one of two things. Either before the coming of Christ, they for the most part are a kind of blind man reaching towards the truth, and sometimes coming close to it in the way that man told stories. And after the coming of Christ, it is a way of telling, or a way of echoing the central story of the gospel in a way that can bypass, this is how I see it, bypass the rational part of the person, and speak more directly, more deeply to the heart in a language that easily evades rational objection. So that's a very broad term, but maybe it's a place to start.
Yeah, if I could maybe add a pedantic distinction, or a pair of pedantic distinctions.
Are you going to do the myths versus fairy tales thing? Is that what you're going to do?
No, I'm not going to do that.
I should hope not.
I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Because I mean, the thing about the only difference between a myth and a fairy tale is one of specificity.
Yeah.
Right. You know, but no, so just a couple of things. One is that we do have this weird double usage of myth in the English language, where by it we both mean something that most people think is true but isn't, right? And so like a commonly held myth about ... right? That's one common usage, certainly one that Tolkien did not appreciate. But that is like that's a common way to use the word. The other thing that it means is exactly what Nicholas was talking about, this idea of this a story that is really, you could say, pregnant in a sense, right? A story that has the ability to again and again and again to give birth to something in the human experience, and give birth to something in the human soul, right? One of my least favorite ways that people will explain, what's a myth versus some other kind of story is they'll say, well, a myth is it's a story that explains something about the world. Why is, like it's one of Kipling's Just So stories, right? How did the crocodile get its tail, or the elephant get its snout, or whatever, right? But that's not really what we mean when that's not really what makes a myth potent. That comes from a very 19th century way of looking at myths where people are trying to say, well, these stories are rubbish, but people seem to have told them over and over again, so they must have been useful for something. And then we can say, well, because these people were stupid, or they're not enlightened, et cetera, then we can we can say, well, this filled a need which we don't have anymore, but that as primitives they had. And of course, what this doesn't explain, and what very quickly certain people started to figure out that this kind of line of reasoning didn't explain, is that it doesn't explain why these stories remain attractive and still grab our attention after all this time. If we're really so enlightened, then at some point Greek mythology should stop being cool. But of course it has not. So this leads to kind of the whole discipline of mythography, right? And so you've got somebody like James Frazer writing The Golden Bough, where he ties a lot of world mythology to like fertility cults and death and resurrection and all this stuff. You've got somebody like Joseph Campbell coming along and sort of identifying a particular myth that he calls the hero's journey. My main problem with these approaches is that they are, hammers in search of nails, right? And so you can always tell when somebody has discovered Joseph Campbell for the first time, because suddenly the hero's journey is the only story there is, and they'll notice it in everything, and they'll just like try to write it over and over again and things like this. And people don't realize, it's a story, it's one of the main stories, but it's not the only story. This is something that Nicholas, you've talked about quite a bit, that there are other stories other than the hero's journey that are still, sort of follow traditional patterns. But the other thing that I'm really interested in is the distinction that is sometimes made between myth versus mythology, with this idea. And this is, again, it's a kind of a pedantic distinction, but maybe useful for the conversation that we're going to have today. And that is, there's some people who make a distinction between myth and mythology, where myth is a participatory story, right? It's a story that people continue to participate in. And so maybe it's a story that sort of explains how we came together as a people, or it explains something about the world, but it's a story that we continue to participate in. And so because of that, it's got a deep resonance, especially for people whose lives have been shaped by it. And then mythology is what you're left with once the participation stops.
The artifact.
Right, it's sort of the artifact of the myth. So you could say the myth is the living thing, and then mythology is what is left over when it stops being alive. It's the bones, it's the skeleton, it's the fossil. Still very interesting and evocative to study, because your imagination kind of fills in the gaps and says, well, what if this thing was alive? What would that be like? But anyway, so I'm not going to insist upon that distinction, but I do think that it's important to bring into this conversation, only because participation is the big thing, right, that we have to sort of figure out, especially as like middle class myth makers, right? There are different levels of participating in stories. One is reading them or watching them or consuming them, but there are other methods of participation as well. Ultimately, if you don't have people participating in your story on some level, then it's dead. Even if you like it, it's very pretty, but if there's no participation to the extent that it doesn't have participation, it's dead. And so, I mean, I'm very interested in superhero stories for a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons that I'm interested in superhero stories is that they have a level of participation which is really unlike anything else. And when I say this, I mean that people who would never wear, I see that Neil is wearing a cross. I have the same cross. It's on my nightstand right now. And so I recognized it when I saw you wearing it. I'm not wearing that one today. I'm wearing this medal, which has the Theotokos on one side and Saint Seraphim of Sarov on the other side. But people who would never wear a cross will wear a pendant or a bracelet with the Superman, the S shield on it, right? I have multiple t-shirts with the Superman S shield on it, and I put them on and I wear them, and it's it's the participation, like when you know participation is real when it's like to the level of being something that's totally subconscious, totally unconscious. I don't think about that shirt when I put it on. I just put it on because I like it. I like Superman. So there is there's a really unique level of participation in our culture in superhero stories, and I mean this is one of the things I think it'll outlive even say Marvel fatigue or whatever the industry is going through right now. So okay, I talked way too much. It's a little rambly, but I think that participation is an important element in the way that we should be thinking about storytelling.
No, I think you made a really good distinction there with that. I think too, because there are modern myths that people are participating in. And so I think one of the things, like when we look back at Greek mythology, we can see that there was a participation, even though we're not involved in that participation, there was something about that participation that was aiming too low, meaning that offering worship to, like, say, Aphrodite or sacrifice to her so you can get the right girl would be aiming too low, right? So there's this other bad association with mythology where people think about, worshiping not the highest thing, like from a religious perspective. So there's that distinction, but at the same time, like, of course, those type of myths, those need to go to the wayside. But I think that there's a way you can use the word. The word is non-dual in that sense, that it depends on how you're using it, what are you using it for. If you're trying to distract people from a truth to your political side or whatever it is, however people tell stories now, would be a bad example of that. But if your myth, and in your myth making, you're condensing and expanding aspects of reality so they can be seen more clearly, interacted with, understood, and integrated, I think that's great. For example, an example of a condensation is, like, I'm working on a werewolf movie right now. So the werewolf is a pattern that we see play out over a larger period of time in people's lives as let's say a man gives over to his appetites and becomes, even maybe say hyper masculine in a dangerous way, or the way people crave things, right? So you can look at this and you're like, oh, what's a good way to discuss this? And I'm not giving you enough of the pattern to really explain what a werewolf is or what it isn't, just hopefully enough that you can understand this example of condensing is you take this larger pattern that develops over time, or pattern you'll see in a movie, like someone going to a crossroads and selling their soul. These are things that happen in real life. This is a true myth in the sense that people will gradually do this. Maybe they won't go to the crossroads and meet the devil in a Mississippi string tie, but they'll do something like that maybe over the course of their ascent into Hollywood or other places. So myth condenses things into a point so that we can see it, something that would have taken us a long time to see. We can see it, and this is how we pass information out to children quickly. It's always been one of the ways. The other side of that is that it will expand things that happen in an instance, like the instance where you go into a space and you see a thing, you don't know what it is, or you misunderstand it, you interact with it, and then you understand what it is. This can happen very quickly. This can even happen when you see something out of the corner of your eye and you turn your head. You'll see this expanded in mythology, even in the entire form, like the Hobbit or the Wizard of Oz is this there and back again journey where we see we'll use Dorothy because that's probably a very well-known story, that she sees home one way and she's not so positive about home, and she goes on an adventure, she comes back and home is reframed. These kind of things happen all the time in very short periods of time for us when we recognize a new thing and it enters our consciousness. So story helps us, like, slow the tempo down on things that happen too fast so we don't know what's going on. And it also condenses things that would take too long for us to understand. So this is how I understand and interact with the myth pattern. Now, a lot of these ideas of takeaways from story are lost in the modern era, because the modern era, when we try to look back at mythology and understand it through the lens of how we consume entertainment now, these things don't seem to make as much sense, because entertainment now, sadly, has been in a lot of ways degenerated down to some sort of like drug deal, where it's like, I want this fix. All right. So you want to be scared, you want to be adrenalized. You're going to go see a horror movie. So when they pitch the film, like, you may not even, you're just a fan of the genre. You don't even know the director. You don't know the actors in it. You're like, oh, this looks like a slasher film. I want that drug. Or romantic comedies and things like this. So once entertainment became so commoditized, I'm not even pronouncing that word properly. I'm not going to go back to it. You know what I meant. So once it became a commodity, and it became an exchange for cash, people had a certain feeling they wanted to walk away with. And like things like tragic stories kind of took a a back seat, and other stories that did more to impart wisdom kind of took a back seat for these more immediate exchanges of feeling for money. So I think that's important to think about when we're talking about, like, you know, something like re-enchantment, or maybe that Richard can explain this idea more later, like the sacramental imagination, trying to restore a certain view of the world where stories become a sandbox in which we can gain wisdom, where we can, you know, our bad ideas can go to die so we don't, or we can see how someone else actually obtained beauty in their life or something beautiful, and we can see that path and we can learn from that path, or we can try it on into our own situations in our life. I think that these things need to be restored, and it's not, and especially at the very lowest point we've hit right now, is that people are making stories for the express purposes of getting you to vote the way they would want you to vote. And so I think that's the lowest form of storytelling we've encountered to date, and it's everywhere. And it's why it's why the entertainment genre is really struggling right now, because they have to put out all this content, and the content is being filled and motivated by sort of irreligious people, anti-traditional people that want to influence your vote. So I think that's
called propaganda.
Yeah, well, right. I just gave a long definition. I could have said it in one word, but I think that word sometimes can just fall flat if we just say it, because it's like,
No,
yeah,
it's true.
propaganda because it doesn't support your thing, but it's not propaganda because it supports our thing. So the word, I don't think, holds enough weight anymore.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah. There's also one thing I would add to all that we're saying here, because the word myth is becoming synonymized in this conversation with story, and which is not necessarily incorrect, but there's something that I heard Martin Shaw say recently, and that's he was having a conversation with Malcolm Guite, and they were talking about, you know, the kinds of stories that tend to last the longest. And Martin Shaw is a mythologist and a myth teller, both, which is a rare thing for a person to be both the teller of the story and the analyzer of the story. It's very difficult to hold those two poles together and not go insane. He does it very well. And his point is that myth is a product of an oral tradition. It's a story that's told. And so it takes a much longer time for that kind of story to be told well, because it keeps getting told over and over again from generation to generation. It requires a rooted culture in a place. It requires a long time. And so all the stuff that Neil's talking about, the commodification of stories and the everything that we're seeing, so the death of the author, the sort of decomposition of good storytelling styles, all of that is largely a product not just of money, but also of a literary culture, of a culture of things written down. And the internet is making that worse, because it's written culture writ large and very fast. So it's not good for preservation. It's good for deconstruction. It's good for breaking things down to its absolute constituent part and as fast as you can. It's not good for cultivating the kind of oral tradition that will give rise to a new kind of myth. So in all that we talk about, this is really what I think we would love to see happen more of, is that.
So
Richard's about to explode.
I just got super excited when you mentioned oral storytelling and oral culture. So you remember a minute ago when I mentioned, you know, like everybody who reads the hero's journey for the first time, like you could, like it's this cosmic shift, you know, and it takes them a little while to actually sort of grow out of it so they can actually go back and appreciate it for what it actually is. So for me, the book was not Hero's Journey. The book was Albert Lohr's The Singer of Tales, which is a very imperfect book by, let's say, standards of modern scholarship. But if you want to understand the way that stories emerge through oral storytelling culture, I mean, this is the book to read. And if I would just say, like, if you want to be a storyteller today, especially when it's kind of weird because on the one hand you have, well, okay, so there's a great book called The Meaning of Superhero Comic Books. It's by Terrence Wandke, probably not saying his name right, but you can go get it on Amazon, The Meaning of Superhero Comic Books. And he spends, he's a great sort of student of Lord, and he spends the first several chapters of his book laying out a very careful argument, demonstrating how the emergence of the pulps and superhero comic books in the early 20th century here in the United States actually follows the patterns of oral culture more than it does literary culture.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it's a brilliant argument. I'm not going to try to reproduce it here just because of time's sake, but anyway, I strongly recommend if you're interested in this sort of thing, picking up that book and reading at least the first 4 or 5 chapters. But so this is the interesting thing, is that there's a sort of, let's say, like a hyper reality about film and about especially really big budget film. Okay, hyper reality, like in other words, more real than real. And this is, and one of the effects that it has is the effect of sort of obliterating the more mythological components of storytelling, and specifically this sort of oral approach to it. So
Disney's the biggest
right, yeah,
hyper-real
yes,
sinner.
yeah, Disney is the primary offender here, right? Like
Put that
once
on a shirt. Disney is the primary offender.
yeah,
And we're done. No
I
more.
love it. I love it. Yeah, that's how we're gonna fund your next film. We'll just sell t-shirts.
Disney be good.
Yeah, but once Disney does a thing, and I'll include like the Marvel films in this, right? There's a generation of people who consider themselves fans of superhero stories that have a totally different relationship with all of these characters and these tropes and these, you know, certain like heroic archetypes and things like this than somebody who grew up reading comics. Just a totally different relationship, and a relationship where the characters, because they're tied so specifically to a specific portrayal and a specific actor, etc., that the character actually kind of loses its, you know, one of the things that makes a myth is that it's repeatable. You can repeat it in a different context, right? This is why Shakespeare's plays have the ability to kind of transcend just being a play about it, like a specific period in Italy. You can take The Merchant of Venice or Much Ado About Nothing, and you could set it in a modern setting, and you'd be able to tell the story, and it would be still recognizably Shakespeare, right? So there's a kind of a mythic quality to those things, even though those stories aren't properly speaking myths, right? Superheroes used to have this, and one of the kind of the effects of streaming and of all these, you know, big budget, let's say cinematic universes, one of the effects of the whole idea of a cinematic universe is that it's actually it's taking something of the mythic actually away from the product, and instead it's nailing it down to a very specific brand. And that is something that I think we need to be really aware of, because film doesn't have to do this.
That's right.
Right. Neil's got a great, I would say, fairy tale, right? That he did recently, Queen of the Night, and you know, I've been here on your channel before, Derek, to talk about Queen of the Night, and I've been really pleased to see it's been doing so well streaming lately. That's really, really exciting to me, because you know, on the one hand, it's such a niche project, but on the other hand, it is, you know, it's a really beautiful, interesting story, but it's also told in such a way that it leaves the kind of space, that it leaves the kind of room that a fairy tale or that a myth needs to leave. So,
yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad I'm talking to you guys too, because you're as a musician, I don't think about the participatory side of things as much, because it's kind of baked into music. Like if people like the song, they walk around and they sing it. And if you happen to put something profound or worth ruminating on into that song, they're going to be ruminating on these things. And then also, like, you know, superhero world, when you're a kid, or like when I used to watch the Dukes of Hazzard, and I'm dating myself here, or like Knight Rider, we would go out and act those stories out, you know.
right, yes,
but
of course.
as an adult, this isn't a thing. But I mean, I'm kind of isolated from it in a way at the same time too, because like it's like, oh, what do you do with your faith? Well, I'm Orthodox. We participate, you know. So it's like at all these levels in my life, they're very participatory, and we walk around singing. We try to write things that people can go and sing themselves. So that's a really interesting point you bring up. And
I just would say you would be, one of us would be deeply embarrassed. I'm not sure who, but one of us would be deeply embarrassed if I were to tell you which one of your songs I sing in the shower the most.
Oh no, I don't even know. Like, oh, you have to say it now.
It's the C-word Suffragettes.
Oh my gosh, that's yeah. Kate and I wrote that one. That one's, if you guys haven't found that one,
oh my gosh,
C-word Suffragettes. It's
a little salty. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Yeah.
You're someone got that
The
tattooed.
shower, the great testing grounds of myth.
Yeah, but it's a
Hey.
little salty, but it's the one that like sticks in my brain.
Okay, well, that's the problem. That's one of the things about, when you want to grab someone's attention right now, right? Like I was just reading a Flannery O'Connor's quote about this, where she's like, there's certain things that bother us in the world, like as Christians, that just will not bother other people. And so, yeah, if your audience is totally sympathetic to these problems, you don't have to work very hard to point out the problem. But if you want to point out the problem to people who are numb to them, you have to make a shocking character to do so, or a shocking instance to do so. So I will use stuff that in my material every once in a while that's a little shocking. Like my parents will give me pushback, or someone like that will give me pushback on it. And it's like, I just don't know how else to get someone's attention, because they'll never see what I'm talking about if I don't.
You have to do it sometimes. I mean, look, I just read No Country for Old Men for the first time, and I've been trying to avoid that and I finally gave in. That's exactly what's going on there. It's one of the most dark, depressing things you've ever seen, but you come away from reading that book, you have no doubt that there must be a God in the world.
I mean, this is the thing. You have to either tell a story that is shocking in some way, or something that's so supremely beautiful that you're not able to ignore it. Those are the only options.
Yeah.
Well, and so too, the these patterns, like what he's talking about, like he now it's an unusual thing for me to hear someone say I read No Country for Old Men, though, at the same time, and say, oh, I can't come away from that thinking there's not a God. You don't hear, I haven't heard that come in any of the book reviews or reviews of that project at all, ever. So, so you're coming from a very specific perception. And I think it's something similar to the way I see it, in the sense that if your story participates in reality in a way, and if it's really participating in reality, it's going to garner interest, especially if you're pointing out something that's on the tip of someone's tongue. It's something they've been wrestling with, but they haven't seen it or been able to put it into a profound statement. It's going to be interesting automatically. And if it participates in reality, the way things really are, that's what I mean by that. And then it doesn't matter if it's a happy ending or a sad ending. In a sense, God wins the story. Because, if this is what's maybe confusing about people about the Bible, is that, a lot of the heroes of the Bible and the patriarchs in the story, like they aren't able to get there. They aren't able to embody all of it. They fall short. And when someone falls short, like the apostles recorded themselves in the Gospels falling short, when someone falls short and they tell the truth about it, we win, right? Like, this is the beauty of life, and this is the beauty of storytelling. So if something dark happens, it's something you don't necessarily want to look at or think about often, has to come up in a story. And and if it does, and it's done the right way, everyone wins at home if they are able to extract the right pattern out of it in a non-dualistic way, in the sense that a tragedy teaches us what not to do, if you're going to think about it, something that straightforward or polemic, and a comedy teaches us what to do in a way. So I think I just thought that was such an interesting takeaway you had from that, and worth mentioning the fact that what's really at stake with storytelling is that if you tell the truth in a way that's encapsulated properly, and you have the gift to do that, it's going to automatically be interesting, and people are going to be the wiser for participating in your story.
No, but it's an interesting point you make. I mean, you're probably true. Most people who've read the book probably won't have that immediate impression, and that's part of what you need in a mythological culture, is you need to have the context, the larger context, to be able to interpret the stories, to be able to participate in them correctly, and to be able to come away with the right the right mediated response to it. I mean, it's very easy to read Cormac McCarthy and to go and commit suicide after that. I haven't read Blood Meridian. I'm holding off, even though Harold Bloom tells me I must. It's one of the greatest novels of all time. But if No Country for Old Men was difficult, that one's much worse. But I am reading Man's Search for Meaning right now by Viktor Frankl, and he shows it right there, what it means to be a part of a community mediated culture, because in the midst of the worst experience that humanity can possibly have, what brought him through were beauty and love. Two things that you can't experience unless you experience it in community, unless you experience it as part of a rooted culture that is telling stories. You can't have it. Doesn't work out outside of it, because the best you can come up with, if you don't have that, is a very loud form of propaganda, which is really what's going on right now. And a lot of people are noticing this kind of hijacking of narrative. There's books coming out by people who have been who previously have been champions of the use of narrative to transport a message. And even many of these people are quite postmodern in their philosophical leanings, and even they're like complaining, like, stop, this is too much. It's not everything is a story.
Well, so when I was an evangelical, when I was younger, like, we suffered in this world of propagandistic art making, like, and then you could even see it, like, there's some extreme examples of it. When I remember we're driving around in like around 2007, 2008, I started seeing these billboards appearing everywhere for Christian radio. And it was in the pitch of the billboard was safe for little ears.
Yeah.
As if Christianity was like the safe story. It's like, it's the most, like, if you look at a crucifix, like, I remember this as a kid, there's nothing else like that in the world. And you're fixated on it because there's nails going through someone's hands in a sculpture. It's like, this is not safe for children. And so I thought it was such a bad reduction of it. And the idea that, well, we're going to tell a story that's going to change someone's mind, like that idea. And that, okay, I thought I was escaping it when I was able to, like, suddenly be allowed to watch things that were a little bit outside of that and felt a little more honest. But no, not anymore. It's everywhere. That pattern is everywhere now in storytelling. It's this horrible, disenchanted, slamming a message down your throat.
Except in Andor.
I have been so reluctant to watch Andor, but
it's so good.
Everybody's promising it's good.
Yep.
It's actually quite good.
I mean, that's a really good example, though, for what we're talking about, because you look at Star Wars and, like, there's just so many stories and nuances that are, published by Lucasfilm or by the brand or by Disney Star Wars. But then there's also all of these fan fiction productions. And I was looking at one, Star Wars Theory, $100,000 fan fiction for like a 2-minute video of Darth Vader and doing all these really cool things. Superb. Better 2 minutes than the whole last sequel trilogy. So I just think about that. And then what's really cool about some of that is, like, especially the episodes where they have some time to, like, they release the first one and the second one and they get some feedback from the audience, like what Neil was talking about. And if it's really, really bad, people don't buy it. If, like, all the chatter is just really not good or is divisive or what have you, then they still have time. Like in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, they changed how the 5th and 6th episodes ended up because
really
the feedback they got. Yeah, the 6th episode.
Well, it didn't make it any better.
They re-edited it, I'm sure.
Yeah, the 6th one was okay. As far as a mop-up job, it was not too bad. But I would say, like, then you have Andor, right? And then Andor is just high quality storytelling down to every single detail. And you can tell they care about the audience. They care about the greater myth and the greater canon of the stories collectively. And then, so they're not just like servicing their crowd, they're telling us timeless story of what it means to be a family and a people that care about things during hard times. And so it's very enduring.
On the surface of it, it seems to be the least mythic of all the Star Wars stories.
Right, yeah.
But it's not. It's doing the myth thing in a very specific way, in a very beautiful way. And it's really interesting. It's transcending its own creators' propagandistic tendencies. And I'm not saying that Tony Gilroy, the writer, is necessarily a propagandist, but Fiona Shaw went on record saying that this is an anti-Trump fascist show, anti-Trump, anti-fascist show.
Yeah.
Before it even came out. So a lot of people were like, I'm not watching this because it's just going to continue the streak of the very rich people of the laptop class telling us how we need to think and live. But I'm watching this and I'm like, that's not what's going on at all. I mean, it's more like a take on the Gulag Archipelago than anything, especially in the prison section. That's a
right. All right, I'll watch it. Fine.
It's really good.
I
Neil,
mean,
you're missing out.
So first of
20
all,
people have told me this, and I don't believe any of them because I watched Boba Fett.
Boba Fett was crap. Come on.
Not
this
even.
one was the moment where I was like, no one can talk me into this crap ever again.
Yeah. Plus the music's really
now,
good.
then they go and totally redeem themselves with Andor. Come on.
I mean, stop clocks, Neil. Stop clocks. But listen, I was talking to somebody about this earlier today. I would bet green money that the people involved in writing Andor have read some John le Carre. And I mean, you can talk about I mean, I'm a big fan of the works of John le Carre, who wrote a bunch of Cold War espionage fiction and post-Cold War espionage fiction. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is probably his most famous book. along with a spy who came in from the cold. But I love his stuff. And I find it, I like to say, because I'm the sort of person who just likes to drop provocative things and then not defend them. To me, look, John le Carré's World, the Smiley novels, probably the second or third best secondary world ever made in fantasy fiction.
Wow.
And people will look at that and say, wait, fantasy fiction, there are no wizards here, there's no hobbits here, what are you talking about? But I mean, I think if you look at it and you pay very close attention, le Carré is able to build a beautiful sort of magical secondary world, but he builds it through like mundane, horrible things. And like all the pieces individually are sort of mundane and horrible, and yet when you get to the end of it, it has let's say to the end of the Carla trilogy, so which is kind of like the heart of the whole work. It does have this really resonant mythic effect, and so big fan of those books. But I was getting a lot of le Carré vibes from Andor, and I would bet money that was intentional. So
nice.
This is the kind of conversation you get, Derek, when you invite writers on.
Listen, I don't know if we're on track.
Just so you know, this is what you signed up for.
Man.
Now, hold on, can I ask you guys something? This is a little bit of a subject change, but it's something I've been thinking about, because like what we're talking about based on the conversation is we're kind of talking about like this disenchanted world, like this world that's everything's kind of flat and horizontal. There's not a lot of verticality to the storytelling, and a lot of this gets attributed to materialism. And I think materialism is definitely a tool that's been used to do this, in the sense that, we were told that we were dumb to think like everyone has ever thought, in the sense that the world was created, the world is intelligible, the world we see communicates meaning about the unseen world, right? That's a vertical story. We were told that was dumb, and we were given some kind of explanation of the world that we were here randomly by chance, that things we experience that feel transcendent, like beauty and love, this is a trick played on us by evolution that gets us to participate in child making and things like that, and stable social structures. I don't believe this at all. I think that was a really dumb thing. I think you're not someone's friend if you tell them that's what they're here for. I think that's disenchanting. But I think that over the past 5 years, I think I see the end game of disenchantment, in the sense that, and this is something I don't hear a lot of people talking about, and I think it's in the sense of how decisions of value are made. And I think we have to recognize this so we can see our way out of the trap, meaning that why has storytelling turned into what it is? Like the only thing that ever brings it back right seems like if someone's more focused on money than they are on politics. Like is the only time it seems to go right. Like we want a story that actually sells, and we need to make money, so let's get off politics for a second, right? So I think what's happened, and you can see a best example of this in like cryptocurrencies and like NFTs, in the sense that sure, people can talk about the blurring of gender, they can talk about the dismissal of religion, but at the end of the day, like what's really being instantiated is the idea of how value is given to anything. It's completely subjective. It's this idea that we see through an NFT or through cryptocurrency, as long as people believe it's valuable, right? It holds its value or gains in value. As long as people treat it like it's valuable, it gains in value. So this is like the trick. This is like the aha. See, we told you all along that value is a human construct, that all assessments of these. So what are we left with to do with our stories? We're left with something very horizontal, because how you get your way in the world is to act as if, whether you use Twitter bots, whether you buy likes on your video, whether you astroturf things, whether you lie, whatever it takes, is that what we're left with is that all value assessments of value are completely subjective and completely manipulated. And this is the entertainment culture we get when that's what people believe. And people will moralize it, but at the end of the day, we all know what's going on. It's not a thing of principle. At the end of the day, it has to be anti-traditional, because tradition says value comes from an entirely different place. So this is my recent thoughts on disenchantment and what's happening. Do you guys resonate with that idea at all? Or because I think if we can identify, we can also identify like the way out of it, and the way to help other artists out of it, and the way to help people who consume entertainment out of it.
Well, isn't it a lie? In the sense that they can't even believe their own lie, because if you're going to talk about, we need to make the story that's going to make the most money, look at the things that tend to make the most money on on a huge cosmic scale. They're mythic. They repeat traditional forms. Star
Yeah.
Wars in the 70s was a very simple rehash of the hero's journey.
Mhm.
It's they can pretend like that's what they're doing, but they still go back to the cauldron of story, as Tolkien
I
calls
agree,
it.
totally.
So I mean, they're not
It's
even
like the
trying very
bottom
hard.
level of reality they hit there, though. Like you push a lie far enough, or you push an idea
Right,
that's
yeah,
false
sure.
far enough, you end up into something like even the rocks and trees will start to cry out.
Yeah.
It's like there's a point where like any move in any other direction for any other reason starts to produce something better.
But that's what's going on. Isn't that what's going on with Paul King, with the Paul Kingsnorths of the world, with the Martin Shaws of the world, with these people who are on the sort of, have their hand on the more wilder, the more intrinsic things. And it's from that part of of culture that things are really starting to buzz and starting to bubble up and make an impression on people. On a not on a mass scale yet. We're not there yet. We're still at a point where there is no central stage anymore. We're at the point where Amish vampires in space romance is something that people will read because they think it's fun, and they will just go back to that genre again and again and again. To to your point about commodification, but
The drug you get from Amish vampires.
Do people really read it, or they just buy it for the lols?
For the covers.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I felt it that way about
know.
Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies.
Right, yeah. Except I knew a bunch of
And
people who did read
sensibilities.
that and thought it was really clever, and I was like, what? No.
not clever. Sorry.
No. So I mean, so this is the thing. One of the things that has come about as a result of this sort of collapse of the centralization of storytelling, which I think we see happening right now, right? So you could say there was a buildup to whatever the, I'm hesitant to assign a date to this because I'll be instantly proven wrong, but let's say there was a buildup that started with Hollywood in the 1920s and maybe mid to late 2000s or 20 teens, somewhere in there. There's this buildup all the way with a lot of ups and downs along the way, but just this buildup to the blockbuster, right? The buildup to this is the big movie. I mean, Star Wars is one of the first like really true blockbusters in that sense. I know there are other bigger movies that made more money, but in the sense of being like I understand that Gone with the Wind made like a ton of money and it was highest grossing for a long time and things, but it has not had the same like deep level of cultural impact that Star Wars has.
Generational.
Yeah.
Right, yeah,
Over the generations, exactly. Yeah.
right. And so Star Wars being one of the, and I'm not even really like a big Star Wars guy, but you'd have to be an idiot to not see the deep impact that that Star Wars has had, culturally. There is something about the story that's really resonant with people, very mythic. So there's been some kind of a buildup, and now we're getting to this point where we're in the sort of like a post-mythic blockbuster, where now when you look at films, what are you seeing? You're seeing one of two things happening. One is either self-conscious deconstruction, or which turns out nobody wants to watch, or you're seeing people who are just I made this joke early on in our review of The Rings of Power that it was like if I asked an AI to write me a Tolkien story, this is what it would give me, because it has like on the surface level, here are all these things, and an incautious reader, let's say, could point at these different things and say, oh, but look, it's got trees, it's got elves, it's got art, all of these things, Tolkien things. And you could say, sure, it's paying some lip service to it, but at its core, at its essence, right, there's no depth there. There's no, it doesn't, it's just shallow in the way that if I get an AI generated piece of art, or I ask an AI to write me a screenplay, it'll have the elements that I'm looking for based on the prompts that I gave it, but there is a soul that will be missing from that thing.
Yeah.
And this seems to be where we are right now, with a lot of, especially with the proliferation of so many awful stories on streaming services, right? Now there's some really good stuff happening too, but most of the stuff is just very mid-wit, kind of like very just like, let's hit the high notes because here's the hit that somebody wants. And sure, this drug it's not going to give you the big hit that you were hoping you'd get, but people will say things like, and you know this is happening when people say things like, okay, well, it wasn't great, but you know,
Yeah,
like
that's all you have most of the time.
right, that's what you
True.
get. That's what most of the stuff is. And it's funny because earlier today I was talking to a friend about a movie, and so he went and looked up the trailer, and he said, well, okay, doesn't look great, I'd probably watch it. But then he said, you know, I can't think of the last time I went and actually looked up the trailer for a movie. I said, yeah, didn't movies used to be fun? Like, what happened? But a big part of what happened, as he pointed out, a big part of what happened is streaming, right? A big part of what happened is just like oversaturation. So this gets me to maybe we can kind of circle back around to kind of our original question, which is, how do we become myth makers and storytellers ourselves, right? One of the most important things you can do, I think, is to figure out how to you know, as you see the disintegration of like the big centralized story, right? One of the biggest things you can do, one of the most important things you can do is kind of loop all the way back around and try to get back to that, the clan gathering around the fire at night and telling a story together, right? And telling the same story that you told last week, the same story that you told last year, right? If a story can't be retold, it's not a good story. And so we do this, you know, some
Make that M. Night.
yeah, that's right. So those so those of us who are, you know, Christians, traditional Christians, Orthodox Christians, obviously we do this. Like we have the same story that we retell every year. And I've got a weird memory that's specifically good at remembering certain things. And one of the things that I can tell you is, you know, any given feast day, where was I on that feast day 4 years ago? You know, because I remember, because I remember being in church, and I remember reading the service or participating in the service in some way, like, and those are really vivid memories for me, which are always tied to who is being celebrated or what event was being celebrated on that day. The other thing that, but there are other ways that you can recover this as well that are not as important as liturgy, but are certainly good, you could say, auxiliaries. And so one of the things that I'm working on a lot right now in my own life, and that I've been doing for a number of years, is really focusing on, not focusing, but the use of tabletop role-playing games as a way of, you guys knew I was going to talk about this eventually. The use of tabletop role-playing games as a means of participatory community storytelling. And it's a way to bring people into my life and into my community who may not be ready to come to church with me, but they're willing to come and sit down at a table and tell these stories that are still participating in the, you know, they're still participating in the story of Christ. I mean, it's the story that I've been saturated in my entire life, and thanks, Mom and Dad. And, you know, so really it's the only story that I can tell. But sometimes the games are just, they're just games, they're just silly. Sometimes they get very serious, they get very dramatic, people get really emotionally and spiritually invested in what's going on in the story. And it's okay that they can exist at those multiple levels. Not everything needs to always be like your A game, right? This is the other thing is, you know, I've said frequently, we need a lot of bad art. And by bad art, I mean that like we need to, I don't mean that people should make bad art and then try to publish it and insist that it's good art, but I do mean that we should be okay with, write a story, start out. I mean, this is how everyone has to start. You start out by writing a story for your kids. Start out by writing a story for your friends. I started writing stories when I was a very young person, and there was this girl that I was really into at the time. We have 5 kids now. So how bad were the stories? But
I should ask her.
Yeah, you should
Flip
ask
that
her.
out. That's like how to find the right girl clip.
Right. So I just started, I would write stories and I would send them to her. And honestly, the main thing I was looking for out of that was her approval. Right. And her to be interested, but she was the audience. Right. And then later on, writing stories for friends, with friends. And that's always kind of been how I operate. So I'm always a collaborative person. I don't think I've ever written almost a single story on my own. I've always got somebody I'm bouncing ideas around with. But this is how it starts. If you want to start out as let's say a middle-class myth maker, the first thing you need is a job that's not this. The second thing that you need is an audience, and it needs to be people that you really love and care about, and you need to write for them. Write for them. People say write for yourself, but don't write for yourself. Write for the people in your life that you care about. Tell the kind of stories that are gonna that are gonna integrate you as a community. Another long rant. I'm sorry.
I think that wasn't too long. That was I was waiting for you to go more. Yeah, that's good. Nicholas, I want to hear what you have to say about the same subject. How do you step into that? I just don't know if I know your story.
About what specifically? There's a lot going on.
Sorry, I'm like acting like interviewer. Sorry, Derek. Can you just say what I said? So
yeah, well, I mean, like Richard, thanks for transitioning us over into more of like the practical side of things. Like, what does it mean to tell a story? And from what I can gather, kind of buttoning up the first half of this talk is like, a myth that needs to be participatory. It needs to be centralizing, as in like there's people that are gathering and retelling these same stories, and these stories. It's almost like you can have many stories, and you want to try to have few myths. Does that make sense? Yeah. Kind of back to what Nicholas was talking about, like you don't sit down and say, I'm going to write a myth today. I'm going to make myth. It's almost like, no, I'm going to.
Some of us.
Well, okay, let me stop there and turn it over to Nicholas. So, is that the case? And then, what does this look like practically, for someone that's producing creative storytelling and making myth?
Well, community is important here too, and this is, you start out as Richard suggests, which is not how most people start out. I mean, this is a really wonderful thing. If you come from a storytelling tradition, if you're especially if you're from an immigrant background, of any sort, this is the great advantage that I've had, is that my first language wasn't English, it was Russian, and I was raised on the old stories that Russians have been telling each other for 1,000 years. This is the richest soil for the imagination, but it's also the richest story for just for formation of selfhood in some sense. Not in this kind of, I'm going to create my own reality type thing, which is very popular now, but something much more rooted, much deeper, because all of us have to come to an awareness of what it means to be human and how we fit, how our own unique humanity is going to contribute to that larger story of what it means to be human. So yes, you have to, what Richard said is absolutely correct. And it goes so against what we are told to do now. Now we would just tell your story. That's the thing we're told to do, not to tell a story for an audience, because that's an automatic, it's an act of obedience and love, because you will never tell the story that you want to, because it's going to be yoked to the expectations of other people, and those other people are going to have different tastes. They're going to have different, what they're going to think is good, and if you think that thing is good and they don't, you're not going to tell it because it's going to be embarrassing. So whether or not they're right is almost beside the point. It just trains you from a very early age to understand that when you are creating, you have to create towards an archetype, not just out of what I feel like. But if we're going to take that up a notch, what we don't have yet is a storytelling community amongst us that is going to make possible for people to go beyond the making stories for the family circle to making stories for a larger audience, because the audience isn't there yet. It's there, but we haven't gathered them, I should say, because we've just started doing this thing, whatever this thing is. We haven't really fully figured out what it is. And part of it is coming out of the shadow of Tolkien and Lewis to a certain extent, because what they did was incredible, but it was of a different time and of a different generation and for a different people. And Malcolm Guite was recently asked who's going to be the next Tolkien, and he couldn't come up with anybody writing. He said it's going to be music and movies. That was as good as he could offer. It's going to be a movie or it's going to be music. Yes, that's right. Neil, yes. Neil, stand. This is your stage now. But all that to say that what I hope that is starting to happen now with the movement bubbling around Jonathan and around all of us, hopefully to a certain extent, is that we get to a point where we can become, as we hone ourselves as storytellers, not that we're experts in any way, shape, or form. We're all students, but there hopefully is a way that we can also, reach out a hand to those who are on the journey and hoping to get a little bit higher, because really the idea of apprenticeship is something that you don't have anymore, not in the literary arts. You can't even say that there's such a thing as an objective standard for literature. You're immediately shouted down as an elitist. You can't have objective standards because it all depends on what you feel like, and everybody's gonna have their own standard, and you have to be okay with that.
Subjective value, that's part of the problem, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
notion.
And don't think that that's just a problem outside of the traditional world. That's a problem within the traditional world. I've come across it in some, I'm not going to say exactly what, but some of you know what I'm talking about. I've had some very odd encounters with people within our community that should know better about that sort of thing. So yeah, I think we're all doing something. We're all ready to share what we know, but we're not at a point yet where we can have, the school of Jonathan Pajot or the school of Neil DeGraide.
You never know. I mean, like you look at
school, don't go to my school.
Oh, no.
But hold on, so
I don't know. I'm pretty sure Neil's school is a party school.
Yeah, well, let me just say this. Like, there's it's interesting that it's not like you can just be one role. This is what I'm kind of picking up for you guys, where it's like you can just be the person that tells the story and that's it. It's almost like I look at, Nicholas with your Patreon page, Neil with your Discord server, and the ways that you guys engage with your audience nowadays. And then, of course, with Symbolic World, like you just mentioned with Jonathan Pajot, it's almost like there's a training of the interpretive structure of how it's not just that you're telling the story, you're actually training them how to interpret it at the same time to really appreciate it.
That's why.
Sorry. Go ahead, Nicholas.
I was just going to quickly say that's why, Derek, when you're saying I want to go deep and become a storyteller, you that's good. You want to do that, but I'm not sure that it's possible for us to be only one or only the other. I think we all whether we want to or not have to do both. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's an important point because so until I think something changed in the water or the air. I think the air might be a better way to say it in the new millennium when it came to this stuff, because I started to tap into what people like Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Peterson were talking about with this mythological structure, this re-enchantment. I was already there, but I didn't know because I thought I made it up. I sensed that there was a shift and that there was more power in talking about any idea I had through more of a mythological lens, a little bit, right? And so typological lens, you could say that as well, too, if you get offended by the word mythology. And it wasn't until I found people that were talking about it that I knew that I was actually being coherent in what I was saying. It was like, so Jonathan was really helpful because, and I mean, we probably all met him because we had our own audiences, but he was really helpful where he would come in and just basically explain to me why this was coherent. And with this more ancient way of storytelling. And I think that is so much more powerful now. But what you guys are talking about, so what Richard said is something that would never be a business plan ever, but is exactly the right answer. It's like the idea of sit around a campfire and tell stories, like, because I do tell my another version of that same thing. And what Nicholas is talking about, like the paths to it, people want to know the point. They want to be enough already, and they want to find a spot where they can just be dropped in. Right. And people come along all the time. They probably do it to you guys too. They want to borrow your audience. And they have no audience. It's like, I don't know if my audience is going to like you because you don't have an audience. If you have an audience and I can see an overlap, let's lock arms, right? All day long. But if you don't have an audience, and so the process of gaining an audience, so this would happen in music. So the version of Richard's story I would tell is that, I'd be in a city like Louisville and somebody would come to me and they know I would work in Nashville a lot. And I had friends in high places and they'd be like, hey, I'm going to make the move to Nashville. And I was like, no, you're not. Like, you're not going to make the move to Nashville. It's like, why am I not going to make the move to Nashville? It's like, well, okay, like look around this city. Like you have to be the go-to person in this small city, right? At least like your friends have to want to show up for the shows and out of obligation, out of like, they can't wait to see it. They have to introduce it to people who don't know you or have any kind of relationship with you, who come and stay, right? And when you start to see these things and you become the go-to person in your area, then by all means go and, kick it out with everyone else in the world who was the best in their city. Go for it if you want to take that route. But you have to, you have to have an audience, because the audience, like, oh, sure. So like my part of my process is I definitely start off by trying to please myself with an idea. And when I think it's a good idea, then I start to push it outwards and I test it on people. Like I test it on everyone. I don't keep it a secret to myself, because this is how I learn. This is how I get feedback. And you can tell the same thing when you guys do public speaking. You can tell, like, I will change what I'm talking about based upon what makes people light up, what makes them go quiet, what makes them all put their phones down, whatever it is. If I know I'm onto something, I will start to drill into that thing. And so, but this is what you learn as an artist. You learn that there might be some things you're very good at that people just don't understand. I mean, like as a guitarist who grew up in the 80s, there was a part of the whole entire 90s where I had to put an entire skill set away because nobody understood it or saw it as relevant. Now it came right back in the 2000s, but I put it away because I was paying attention, and I wasn't going to force something down people's throat just because I was good at it. At the same time, there are other things I didn't realize I was good at, but when I watched an audience, they told you. So you get excited about those things, and then you eventually, hopefully, this can go bad too. You bring the right people into your inner space with you. There's people you know, and you learn how to test it off them, even when they're not there. You're like, oh, so and so is going to love this, or so and so would hate this.
100%. I have a million conversations a day when I'm writing a story or an adventure or something like this, and I'm like, oh man, Ben is gonna flip out over this part, or no, I don't think this would play at the table, and so like you sort of like, once you start to know your audience, you kind of moderate what you're doing. I mean, this is very important. You need at least two people in your life, right? One person to just enthusiastically encourage you for all those times you're going to be discouraged. You need a cheerleader, and then you also need somebody who will just always be ruthlessly honest with you.
They're both your wife.
They can, well, they can be true. But this is no, I really love I really love what you said about like the idea that you got to be the go-to guy or gal. You got to be the go-to person in the place,
in the small pond,
in this little small pond, even if that little pond is literally 4 people. Right, you can build from there. But so this is so recently I did this event where we got together when I was in Wichita back in October. We got together and we just read English ghost stories, like old English ghost stories, around a bonfire.
That's awesome.
For about 3 hours.
Wow.
And some of the ghost stories were like original 17th 18th century ghost stories, but one of them was an original story, and it was an original story that was due to be published in an anthology soon. So the guy who'd written it wanted to read it to us to see what we thought, and it was a great story, very spooky, very evocative, kind of a twisty ending. I really loved it. But I mean, that's the kind of culture that we've got, like, sort of that's a priori to any of the discussions about how do you make it as a creative person. Well, I don't know. Nicholas and Neil have both made it as creative people to a much higher degree than I have. But if you don't have a sort of healthy collaborative community, right? Some people that you could say, let's go out to the bonfire tonight and I'm going to read you this ghost story, or I'm going to read you that, like, if you don't have those people in your life, that's step number one. And every time I say this, somebody tries to manufacture this community by saying, oh, well, I don't have people here. What if we started an online community where we do feedback?
Stop.
And like, it's terrible. It's terrible. Other writers are the worst people. Like, once you get to a higher level, then you can start talking to other writers. But early on, a bunch of novice writers are just the worst people to get feedback from, because everybody is just focused on their own thing, and they're like, okay, when is it going to be my turn to talk about my thing, right? So you need So you need to first of all cultivate just this culture of hospitality, and this kind of like shared storytelling, build a mythos within your little community. 2, 3 people, 4 people, start there.
And it's so beautiful to do that. It's really not that hard. It's just a matter of getting people in a single space, making it beautiful, lighting some
don't need to be
candles,
interested.
making food, and then just
Get everybody like a little bit of wine,
Mhm.
you know,
Derek, I
or a
don't know if
lot
you
of
saw.
wine, depending on how good your story is.
I don't know if you
yeah,
saw it in the
well,
chat. I was hijacking because Nicholas said he had to go soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Can we ask him about his Kickstarter? Because like really, when I saw this, I haven't talked to him about it, but when I saw that, I was like, this is exactly what we need to be doing, because this is what I hoped would happen when people started coming together. Because you collaborated with Heather Pollington and Vesper Stamper, both like two of my favorite artists out there. Like, how did this all come about? They look like it looks like a success so far. Can you tell me about that? Can I selfishly ask that question? Because I want to do something like this in the near future.
It's so the whole thing was the idea was crazy. It was a last minute crazy idea that I had that really only happened because everybody I talked to misheard me and thought I was talking about next Christmas. So they all agreed under false pretenses. And then when the thing started to make money, they're like, wait, what? You mean now? So I mean, I'm being slightly facetious, but at least one of them was like, I thought it was next year. So that was, but this is what happens when you start gathering this community, and largely it's thanks to Jonathan. So he's been doing the hard work for the past, Jonathan Pajot, for the past however many years. And so he, as somebody who understands, as somebody who is deeply rooted in this kind of culture, because he's somebody who is a bearer of a culture that is passed down as an icon carver, and even more so than his symbolic thinking. Now he started to extend invitations out to people who are not necessarily Orthodox Christians, but definitely are sort of Orthodox adjacent, but more importantly understand what he's doing and want to contribute their artistic talents to the larger vision. However it will manifest without us really deciding what it's going to be. This is a very amorphous thing. It's how art works. And because he gathered these people together, we realized that we like each other's company just simply as human beings. So there were opportunities for me and Vesper to be in the same room for extended periods of time. She signed up for a writing class that I've started with Jonathan and John Paul Kingsnorth. And Heather is she's incredibly generous with her expertise and with her, she's just an incredibly generous human being, just very unassuming, very humble. It's just incredible considering her body of work. And so me being the person who doesn't really care about niceties, I was like, hey, want to do this thing together? And yes, then the microphone stops working at important moments so that they go, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. And then I go, great, sign on the dotted line quickly, and there we go. But really what the Kickstarter itself is, it's an attempt, it's what I'm doing, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that that the model that the commodification model that Neil, you're talking about, is not the only model financially speaking for us who are doing this as a life, as a calling, as something that we want to do more of. So we hope there's going to be some financial rewards, not so that we can become rich, but so that we can just put food on the table, right? Let's be honest. The model that everybody tells you about is volume, shove your thing down people's throats, do as much as you can, and niche up as much as you can, and just keep piling on that niche until that niche chokes from the excess of crap that you've heaped on them. But in the meantime, you've made 6 figures a month for a few years. And so after that dies, you can just, I don't know, go get depressed. But this is a different model. This is a model that's more ancient, even though it's a modern internet technology. But crowdfunding is an opportunity to get a group of people involved in an idea, so that they feel like they're contributing to it, not only with their money, but with their enthusiasm, with their ideas, with their contribution, with their participation. We keep talking about participation, and it was an incredible thing. I mean, I reached out to a small group of people to try to get it, kind of over a hump on the first day or so. But the thing, there was so much excitement over it. I was reaching out to people. They were like, yeah, I'm so happy to help. This is so exciting. And, I'd love to take part in this. And the fact that it's a thing that's crafted, it's handcrafted, it's going to be beautiful, I hope, if everything works the way it should. It's designed gorgeously by Heather, and Vesper's baking. I mean, like, the whole process is insane. It's like an old fashioned way of doing things. Like, I just threw them the book. They're opening it, they're reading. As they're reading, they're doing illustrations because they don't have time to let the story kind of sink in. It's just this, let's talk about collaborative storytelling. It's kind of nuts. But the
Love
idea
it.
here is make something beautiful, make something tangible, make something that is not just a book that you buy on Amazon, right? It's something that is a little bit better, something a little bit more special, and make that the thing that you draw attention to, and allow then people to the not the market, but individuals to say, yes, I want to participate, or no, I don't want to participate. So there's a moment there where you have to let it go and say, I don't know if I did the right thing or not. I don't know if this idea is going to work or not. I did everything I could. It's up to you guys now. And that's the only way these things can become successful. And certainly did happen with this one. So
Did you meet your mark? The
sorry,
Kickstarter goal? Did you meet your mark?
I met it in the first 4 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, he blew past it. This is something I hope that everyone sees. So like when you're talking about, like when people are talking about the meaning crisis and they're talking about what's going on in this corner of the internet, this is a great example of how to take it beyond just this conversation, right? So that's when I see that, like, I hope people like watching or follow Nicholas and Richard's got this other project coming up. I hope they understand that, like, they can vote for the world they want to see. If they want better stories, they can vote to by kickstarting things like that. Like, you gave people the opportunity to vote something into existence in a way with their money. And I think that's one of the ways out of this problem we have in entertainment is what Richard's describing is kind of grassroots, organic, starts around a fire. These people rise up. They become the people that we realize we can put some level of trust in. Not that every artist can put out something perfect every time,
Right.
but when you, as a community, when you see people you can put your trust in, by all means, like if you have the opportunity to, you can't complain. There's not enough good things in the world if people are giving you opportunities to fund them, like Nicholas.
Yeah.
So I think that's, I was so glad to see you do. I was so glad to see that it came out of people like in the community who are like some of the most talented people in the world. So I think you guys are all world class. And so I think this was a no brainer. When I saw it, I put money into it immediately.
Well, yeah.
Well,
No, I gotta say, I went ahead and just went the full shebang, and I got the high quality deluxe version.
Oh, yeah,
That's like wrapped up in a map cloth and stamped with the wax seal and all of that. And it's like, I mean, you talk about the bow, just like
yeah,
cherry on top.
that's right. Well, that was the idea. That's what I was hoping for, is that, not just to gild a lily, right, but to provide an experience for people so that they can, because this is really what we didn't have during the pandemic, the kind of tangible access to things that are crafted beautifully. And coming out of it, this is what we want more of, really. I mean, everybody does, and we're not getting it. We're not getting it in our streaming. We're not getting it in the books that are being published. We're just not getting it in the stories.
Everyone's
going to, so.
And everybody who senses meaning, who doesn't know how to anchor it in a real culture, is going to turn to psychedelics. Is what
That's
it's
right,
looking
and they
for.
already are.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
it's like, this is part of the meaning crisis. Is like, I'm watching people drop this new atheism that came about in the 20th century.
Oh, yeah.
So fast. And, but I think to people without the proper culture to support it, it looks like a shortcut. It
is a shortcut, 100%.
Well, it is. You gain some insight, but you don't have the connective tissue beneath it. You don't have the support structure beneath it. You don't have the lifestyle around it, like Richard's talking about. You need this participation. You need to have a community to participate within the myth. You need a ritual space for that as well. So I think I think that's why what you're doing is important. And I'm going to try to copy this next year. I'm going to try to kickstart my next film.
There we go.
Well, I hope you do, and I hope that and I do know that Jonathan has a bunch of projects coming up that he's going to be crowdfunding as well. I really think, and I hope that this is going to be a kind of movement that doesn't. It's not just an elite movement that's created by gatekeepers, but something that is properly a barn raising in the good old fashioned sense.
Yeah,
and I'll have a bunch of tabletop stuff kickstarting in the spring, but also going to try to start doing, Neil and I have a couple of ideas, and I'm also going to try to start doing some kind of like let's say like designer diaries or theory videos pretty soon here as I'm putting my game together for publication, but also just talking about why tell stories this way, how do you tell stories this way, how do you do it and do it well, those kinds of things. So should be a lot more coming soon. So yeah, vote for the world that you want. Yeah,
it's going to be great.
Vote for the world that you want. Yeah, I'm voting for your worlds. That's all I know. I vote for you guys all the time. I'm rooting for you. And Derek too. I think you've shown a lot of promise though, like with your ability to incorporate, like you've been learning, and I think don't stop the blog essay writing. Like, I don't know, you can, if it's your decision, but I just think you do. It's so coherent and concise and clear when you
Well,
do it.
sometimes there's waves, right? We have to sometimes go
Crises.
deep to do something else, and then we can come back.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, so that's the other thing people need to remember. Like Jonathan, like if you want to use Jonathan's example, that guy worked his butt off. Like
Right.
he was carving, he was doing the Orthodox Arts Journal, he started doing the Symbolic World, started doing public speaking, started managing
Living in
a YouTube
Africa.
channel, started managing a Patreon, started doing Patreon only stuff. I mean, like that's probably what your lives look like. I mean, I think Richard's got a day job and he's doing all this on top of that. And for the artist, time and money is not an excuse, man. It's just not.
Yeah.
You're going to have to learn to do it as you do things, and you might do it better because you're a busy person. So, I mean, I work my butt off. I mean, and people want to know like how to be like, it's not like for a musician, it's not like just someone's going to give you a record deal and it's going to be all up, it's going to be all, wine and roses from there. No, it's
Nope.
just not it. You're going to have to find a way to enjoy working a lot,
Yep.
not neglect your family at all at the same time.
Very hard, but very true.
Well, I had a few more questions for Neil related to Queen of the Night, as well as for Richard. Nicholas, at any point you need to sign off, we bid you farewell and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I will sign off. I have a few other things.
I'll pan my camera to include my library so we don't lose the books.
Very good. Thanks, Neil. All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so Neil, that is encouraging. Like one of the takeaways that I already have is not to just ditch one for the other, because I look at, like, for example, taking a deep dive into your content with Queen of the Night, of course, Richard and I having a conversation with Garrett related to Queen of the Night, the fantasy silent film you published episodically, and then as a full release just a matter of weeks ago. That was almost like an education that I got to do with people. So like, I'm trying to study these patterns and ways of storytelling. It's a great example in a 5-act or 5 episode story. But then it's like, I publish something and then people publish a whole bunch of comments, and then I learn from those, I take those. But having, taken a deep dive into that, but then also other stories like Arrival, the sci-fi fantasy, or the sci-fi movie and book that came out in 2016. I'm still not quite done with those essays. I feel like there's still more. I feel encouraged to do that, kind of like showing people how to see this film and all of the rich patterns that it has and layers on top within a single story is amazing. But at the same time, like, I'm getting to that point where I'm like, before I die, I have to share these stories that I've been receiving, I guess would be the best word, or coming up with or adding to since I was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, I'm kind of into those birth pangs of like, either these things get out or like, what's my life for? Like, I want to set a good example for my children. I want to, like, they look at me and they said, did you use all of the talents that God gave you, to refer back to the parable? And I'm like, nope, I just buried them under a bushel. I didn't share them with my friends. I didn't share them with my community. I didn't get them out into the broad world. I just kind of enjoyed working on them, and then commented about symbolism. Like,
yeah. No, that's really good. Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, very short, and then I'll let you talk about Queen of the Night. I don't know who originally said this, but I heard it from Malcolm Guite in a talk that I attended that he gave. But he was quoting somebody else, and for the life of me, I can't remember who it was. But he said, the only honest response to a work of art is another work of art. And you're totally right. Or I think it was Nicholas was the one that just said this, like, Jonathan's symbolism videos are amazing, but that stuff flows out of intuitions that he's garnered from reading traditional stories, but mainly from being an icon carver, right? Which is this deeply fundamental, like to take the lowest thing, like dead matter, and to join it to the highest thing, right? Which is what happens when you make an icon. This is that's a really just like a really mythic activity, right? And so I think that there's definitely a sense in which like sometimes you have these ideas and you deal with the ideas, like it's, you can lay out your thoughts in essays and stuff like that, but then to really find out what the idea means, to really find out, you know, whether or not it's true and things like that, you have to experience it as a story. That's the way it is for me anyway. Whenever I encounter
yeah, the technology of what we're talking about, it's a weird way to say it, but or it's the tool. You know, so like in an archetypal story like, you know, Cain and Abel, we find the first like weapon, the first tool, and it's, you know, Cain looks down at the earth, sees a rock, picks it up, lifts it above his head, and now he has a force multiplier. Where he could have bruised his brother, he now kills him, right? So you're like, okay, that's a great example, Neil. You don't want to kill people with your stories. But what I'm saying is people don't think of the narrative world this way. They think of the physical universe as technology and tools, but we need force multipliers for the right stories as well. And so that's kind of what we're dealing in, because you have a story, it's in your head, you tell it to friends, right? Your voice can only go so far, and that's why people don't see that as a business model. Like, it's like, yeah, you can't go around to campfires and charge enough money to tell enough stories. You need to eventually choose the right force multiplier for that story. And, you know, for me, it's just been a way, like, so when we talk about Queen of the Night was my way. Like, I've always loved films. I've made films as a teenager. I made films with my friends. I literally used the same people I made films with as a teenager. My friend Pete, like in middle school, like we made you know, kung fu films and stuff, and I brought him in to help me make a film just like we used to. And then everyone in the film is a friend of mine, except for like one or two randos that just were like, we didn't know anybody who did that thing, and they weren't randos when they were done. They were friends with all of us. So you know, so doing it that way and finding like a force multiplier for a story, I was like, yeah, this story needs something bigger than a concept record. So we do a film. It's like, okay, I'm not a filmmaker. How do you step into something? How do you find your way into a new force multiplier for your narrative? I was like, well,
what do you mean by a force multiplier?
Like for a force multiplier, meaning like my fist can go this fast, right? Now, if I pick up something heavy, now that we know the physics of it, that's going to do way more damage when it hits. It's the same with a tennis racket. This is why people can throw a tennis ball, you know, 90 miles an hour, but they can hit it with a tennis racket 130. So that's what I mean by force multiplier. So like and also it goes farther, you know, even an amplifier is a good analogy. It's like, oh, if I don't plug my guitar into anything, people in the back row won't hear this. But if I plug it in, you know, that I can make it so everyone in the room hears it. So when I was trying to pick a venue for that, I was like, okay, I can back my way into this. If I do silent film, I'll limit the cinematography elements. I know I'm a visual artist already. I can lean on my own visual art instincts to kind of create the backgrounds and things like that. I didn't have to worry about capturing audio on the set. I could still put my own music to it. So it was like you try to find the solution for what you don't know yet, or what you can't do yet, while you're moving up, you know, into the narrative world. So when you're looking for a platform or a way to tell your story, whether it's a book, like some people think they got to write the perfect novel right out the gate. It's like, no, make a little tiny something you could finish. You're going to learn a lot by finishing things. So when someone wants to get into something, you can get stuck in this place. Like there's a guy, his name is Dexter Palmer. He like wrote one novel, and it's an incredible one. And he's like one of the few examples of people that can do this. It's called The Dream of Perpetual Motion. But he wrote it forever and like released one book. And like, that's not sure that worked for him magically. But there's like 1,000 other ways to do small things as you work up incrementally. So I'm working on, in Queen of the Night, I included a community with that process from the very beginning. So people who want to get close to us and get involved in our Discord or get involved with us in social media and follow us, they can go through the whole process of seeing the story unfold for themselves in the creation process. I thought that was a lot of fun and a unique experience for the people who went along on that ride. But now that I've done a silent film, it's like, maybe I can graduate to a not silent film, right? Like I limited my variables, and now I want to do that same type of storytelling. I want to layer it with symbolism. I want to layer, so every direction you look, you can go deeper. And this is one of the reasons I talked to Richard when I was doing this, because I was like, Richard, like I want to do, there's a big werewolf element to my story. How about you help me research this so that because you have to pick character names, you have to pick objects to put on the shelves when you're making a movie. You have to pick all kinds of details. And why not let those details be informed by great stories that have already exist? So you're adding yourself as just another rock on a big mountain that already exists. So it becomes lore rich, it becomes Easter egg filled, it becomes It's as deep as anybody wants to go, because every name you've picked, every little element, even the costumes, is alluding to a bigger story that participates with your story. So this is how I'm approaching like what we call re-enchantment in a community, is that I'm not capable of just doing anything I want. I try to hide the things I'm bad at from the public as I get better at them. Like I feel like I'm still getting better at things. And so I move outward. I'm expanding outward incrementally, and it's slow. Okay, it's slow, but you get to do it. And I don't have to sit here and answer to someone at a record label telling me I need to write pop radio hits, or I don't need to answer to someone at a big studio telling me I need to include this actress and this message and these things. So I chose the slower path, so I could deliver something I think of higher quality to an audience. So.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how you did it primarily through YouTube, right? And you released, act 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 individually, as you completed them. So It wasn't like you just wrote it, completed it, edited, and then like a year and a half later, okay, finally, here's the film. It's
right.
like you're able
This is
to
the
add
pressure
all
of
these things
the
along
modern
way.
world, though. Yeah, the pressure of the modern world too is content. It's like streaming services have the terrible model for quality now. Like they can't keep up with the expectation we have of what should be charged every month and what they could actually bring to the table. That was doable when there was no competitor to Netflix. Really, that was fine. They had access to everything, but now they don't. And so. So for me, my way of satisfying the need for people who want more from us, or we're their main go-to band. I mean, people share their Spotify Wrapped at the end of the year, which is the bands they've listened to most. And so many people, hundreds and hundreds of people are like, we listen to you like for so many hours. I'm like, I got to make more music because that's way too many hours of listening to the same 80 songs. So I feel this pressure to make content. So I solve that problem by not reducing the quality of my content, by letting people in on the process incrementally.
It's interesting. And then recently you had the full release too, and you did it live as a premiere. And so then like you're engaging with people in the live chat on YouTube. But then you also had like the after party on Discord where people could like join in and like talk about it.
It's an okay substitute for being able to do in-person events, because our audience is too spread. I mean, we might take the film on tour this summer and do some music and show the film in different places around the country. So if you're interested, let me know, and you can hire us to do that. So, but we might go do that. In-person stuff's the best. I thought about simulcasting like a live premiere, but I mean, that's the best thing. It's like I think that people, I don't know. So we have a lot of people. Most people that follow us aren't people of faith like we are. Like there are people out there who are like, gee, nobody's talking about anything with any depth, and we seem to find some depth here. And I'm like, well, I'm so glad. I was hoping that I was hoping there was more depth out there for you, but if we're what you got, that's at least you got us. And so that community, our community online becomes a spot where we talk about like more of these deeper things, like where that source comes from of that sort of meeting. So I think that I just don't think there's enough good content out there for people's souls. I just don't. And so I really encourage, like with Nicholas and Richard are doing. I don't care if you fund my thing, get to their thing first. But I mean, I will like it if you fund my thing. If you want to see us go on, by all means.
Oh yeah, go fund
vote, hit like and subscribe on Derek's video. Do all the things, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's I don't know, I'm having fun, and I really have this weird care for the people we're not around. I wish we were around them in person. I wish we were on the road touring and seeing people. I don't think there's a substitute for that.
But are you guys going to get an RV anytime soon?
That'd be fun. I had an RV. I put my studio in an RV for a while. That was like the glory days. I loved
that. I also think of Richard, your work, like you have a story brewing that's like of the same proportion of, say, like Lord of the Rings. But then instead of like releasing like an all at once Lord of the Rings, recently you released like the hymnography to that story.
And I know it's a very small part of the hymnography. I'm trying to see if I actually have the big book of hymnography around near my desk at the moment.
He didn't let all the cat out of the bag, is what he's saying.
Yeah,
it's kind of similar, right? Where it's like
this volume is very this volume is very slim, and it's really it's like a couple of works of like prose historiography, and then some hymnography and some sort of visionary poetry, I guess you could say. But we sort of did it this way for two reasons. One is, first of all, I never intended to publish any of this. I've just been writing it for my friends and my wife for 2 decades now. And but I met Christopher Tompkins, who runs Darkly Bright Press, and he's just a really interesting guy, really generous person, also a very quiet and humble person. And he has this openness about him that makes it, when you're around him, you just want to also be open. And so I just found myself talking to him about this stuff, and he's like, well, we should think about publishing a book together. And then I was like, hey, we should think about publishing a book together. What do you think about this idea that I just had, that he just sort of like incepted into my brain? And so so the idea was, because it's kind of a weird project, we did just like a little sample, and people seem to like it. And so the next one won't be, again, it won't be everything. We're going to kind of pay it out over a few books for the next few years. But also it's the publication of that book that led directly to getting this opportunity to partner with Strange Owl Press to do the role-playing game. And so there'll be kind of like those two different streams. And it's, you know, some people have asked me like, well, I'm not really interested in this whole role-playing thing, but I would like to read your poetry. And I said, well, that's okay, don't worry, there'll still be a thing for that. But of course, the thing that I'm really excited about the role-playing game is the way that it's going to integrate the two, because I mean, I'm running a game tonight, and there will be poetry. I have like a sort of a 1 poem per session minimum that I'm always trying to hit, you know. Sometimes it's the players pick up on this, and sometimes they are the ones who bring it to the table. But I took this from Tolkien, because in the Lord of the Rings, there's always at least 1 poem every chapter. And you know, I'm always telling people, don't skip the poetry when you're reading Tolkien. So for me, a big part of fantasy storytelling, right, is poetry. Like you could say poetry is the thing that language is for. Prose is abstracted poetry, and poetry is kind of abstracted music. But and so for me, like that's an integral part of the storytelling. And the poetry, you know, I've got poetry that builds on other poetry, and so it's got sort of its own kind of like self-referential interpretive system and things like that. And that's one of the things I'm really excited and sort of like slowly bringing out. So that and this will happen in a couple of ways. One will be through the publication of the books themselves, and then the other will be through the publication of the materials for the tabletop game, which will actually, they'll contain lots of little hidden kind of interpretive keys and things like that. So and hopefully, again, you know, the goal is always to create something that people can participate in. So I don't want people just sitting in a room by themselves reading a poem that I wrote, or a story that I wrote. I want them sitting around a table with 4 or 5 of their best friends, retelling the story that I told, but now they're telling it sort of in their own words, in their own way. And so then it has the capacity to become this living thing that goes beyond just something I did. So yeah, so I'm excited about this, and I am excited that there are still people who want to read poetry at all. Actually, it's pretty neat.
I love that you exist, because you break the myth that you can't be a well-structured romantic. You know, I mean, like, if you're a little bit of a contradiction. I mean, it's great. I love listening to you. Keep going. Sorry, I just need to interrupt.
No, I'll take it. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I had much more to say about that, except that yeah, so we did this little book, and it's done well, and people are already, I think, excited about the possibility of a second book. So the next one will be a little bit larger. It'll have more poetry, but the other thing that's important about this project is that it's not just poetry or stories, but it's poetry and stories with layers to them. So my personal writing process is that I write for 30 minutes to an hour every morning with my coffee. And I always try to write, you know, either like 1,000 words. I'm doing a little more right now because I have some things to knock out, but I always try to either write like 1,000 words or 100 lines of poetry. I'm not expecting it all to be good or of quality. The point is to write. So I do this, and then what I do is I come back to a story maybe a year or sometimes more after I wrote it, and I will rewrite the story, and I'll try to make the second rewrite better. Maybe if I feel like it really needs it, I'll do it a 3rd time. At this point, I have these layers created, but because I'm the kind of person that I am, instead of just ditching the early drafts, what I say is there's kind of like a narrative conceit to all of these stories, is that they're being collected by a scholar at a certain point in time. And so the early drafts, instead of being just drafts that I ditched, they become, oh, these are corrupted manuscripts, or these are other witnesses, or these are different regional variants of the same myth, things like that. And so then when I put them all together into the final product is, here's a story, and then here's a critical apparatus on top of the story that actually reveals these little hidden layers and little hidden gems about the world. And those will only be there for people who read the footnotes. And so, but you could sort of like piece together a whole world just out of the footnotes. At least that's kind of always my goal. So, and again, I do this, largely because it amuses me, but this is what I mean. This particular mode of storytelling is not something which is calculated to sell, ever make the New York Times bestseller list, but it is also creating, let's say, a deep enough pool that other kinds of stories can be drawn out of it. So, we're doing some tabletop RPGs down the road. Who knows? I have a deep affinity for audio drama. I have a deep affinity for some other kinds of media that I would like to get out there eventually. So we'll see what happens.
And it's just mediums of all sorts, just between, just within what you just described, what Neil described, and of course what Nicholas did. It's like, man, if you put that all together, it's like 50 different means of getting the story out there.
That's why he's smart, though, because that's the thing. It's the force multiplier for your narrative. If you choose the one that you have access to, you might have a different one in mind. You might want to be a filmmaker and you don't have access to it. You might want to make a record and you don't have access to a studio. Well, there are other ways to get your story out there. So that's what Richard's doing. I think if people should listen closely, if you're a creator, go back and rewind and listen to all that again, because he just gave you his process. And your process might not look like that, but man, like too many people just have this sort of, block in their process, or they don't realize they don't actually want to finish it because then they're responsible for it. Then they have to give it to an audience. And sometimes it's easier to be hopeless than to have hope, because hope is messy and hope is, you can be disappointed. So, like, I mean, people need to listen really closely when you listen to people like Richard, who are doing such detailed, such like hard world building, such solid world building, is that this is what it takes, folks. You got to fall in love with that. It's a process like that, at least. Yeah.
I mean, you really do have to come up with some way of my dad called this the principle of the slight edge. Which is that you always have to just whittle away at things a little bit, and what does Ecclesiastes say? Cast your bread upon the waters, right? So you have to get up. I mean, I got up today and I wrote 5 adventures, and some of them will be played at my table, and some of them will probably go into future books, and some of them may never see the light of day. But the point was, these were all warm-up adventures for the actual writing that I wanted to do later in the day, right? And so these are, it's like, get the creative juices flowing. Now I'm going to sit down and try to do something long form. So you just have to have this is the thing that creative types don't want to hear, but more than anything else, you just got to have discipline. And the discipline is do a little bit every day. And of course, you can do this if you really enjoy it. But do a little bit every day, but also, like, feel free to, when something is stuck, when something is stagnating, have some other projects to work on. I'm sure Neil always has.
Oh yeah, that's it right there. I
probably
never
14
stop.
or 15 things going at any given time.
Because you don't get stuck. You always have somewhere else to go, and you always have a flow going. So yeah, that's huge. So I mean, some people, I was not a naturally disciplined, structured person. So I have to come up with tricks to get myself going every day, and they work.
Oh yeah.
I know it's a trick, but it works every time. Like, even if I'm just working on a record, it's like super disorganized. Like, I didn't name my files properly. I didn't name my tracks. I didn't cut off and crossfade and do my crossfade. So I'll get up in the morning and I'll do all the nonsense stuff first. And once I start doing it and I start listening to the track or whatever, before I know it, it's 8 hours later, and I did what I think most people would take them 4 days to do in one day, because I found a way to get myself going. And that doesn't work every day, but I have other things I do. And the difference. Like, if you're a writer and you know the feeling, like sometimes you walk out of a movie theater and you're like, you feel taller. Like, I don't know, there's something about like your spine straighter or something, and you're like, I'm walking faster and I feel heroic. And like you like pay attention to like what gets you flowing, right? And what stops you, like, because we have all these gumption traps too, these stupid things we tell ourselves. And I think that's one of the things, the problem of a disenchanted world, is they think that they're alone in their thoughts. And you're never alone in your thoughts, man. Like, there's a whole cosmos in there. There's good and evil, and they're not all you, and you've got to mediate. And so there's all kinds of, as an artist and someone who's truly creative and gets a great response from an audience, or at least a promising response from an audience, you're going to hear all kinds of negativity to stop you, to steal your thunder. And it's not reality. It's not the truth. It's, but if you think you're just alone in your own thoughts all the time, you'll never see that. And you'll just get stuck in this rut of self-defeat and talking yourself out of doing the things you need to do.
You call it gumption traps?
Gumption traps. That comes from Pirsig. That's Pirsig, the Metaphysics of Quality. He has flow state. It was a series of gumption traps are one of the big interrupters of flow state. And the other one is stuckness. So if you want to learn about flow state as an artist, I think Pirsig does a really good job talking about this. What
was the name of that book again?
Well, it's the Metaphysics of Quality. He talks about in Lila. I think he gets more explicit in Lila. I've not read Lila. I've only read the Zen and the Tao of Motorcycle Mechanics. It's not about Zen.
Okay, yeah, I haven't read the book, but I am familiar with it.
Yeah. So the idea is like there are things that you tell yourself that will stop you from creating and following through, and you don't realize it, and it's not really you doing that. It could even be your own, just your own body just not wanting to work because your body rather stay at rest. And then the other side of it, stuckness, has to do with the fact that people do this all the time. Is that they just they aren't constantly collecting, like Richard, someone to do what you do, you have to constantly be collecting and categorizing in your mind and in notes everything you see and hear of interest, like, and you put it into place. And so when it comes time for you to sit down and actually come up with 5 adventures or whatever you did this morning, you have plenty to pull from because you've collected it. You've just got these things waiting. And so I do the same thing. So I'm never stuck. It's like, I don't. Yeah.
So with Queen of the Night, you took 2 or 3 myths and
I've been toying with for a while. Yeah,
that you've been toying with for a while, and you said, well, what if we sort of remixed them and inverted them, and not just the Icarus myth, but also like the Arachne myth, which is fundamentally a myth about hubris, as is Icarus, I suppose. But but the thing is, like, you sort of gather these things and they percolate, right? But things won't percolate if you just sit on them.
Yeah.
So you have to at least like get a pencil out and start trying to sketch some of this stuff out.
Mm-hmm. You pull them in and you play with them. Like you play with these ideas. I play with words all the time. I have words I love and words I don't love. I have ideas that I think are powerful in our universe, because like our band exists not in a space where it represents everything I like or know. It just exists and that it has its own culture, and cultures have things they do and things they don't do, things they prefer, things they don't prefer. So when you pull things in, you collect things, you have all these things at your disposal. You're like, oh, this goes well with this doesn't go well with that, get that out of here. And so when I dream, every time I hear a myth, I always invert it and think about what would happen, and then try to play that out in a way that feels real. So that's like you're talking about with, Queen of the Night. It's like, okay, like what if Icarus goes at nighttime? Why would he still fail is what I was trying to understand. Right. So there's lots of ways to do that. And then again, it's an inversion story in the sense that it starts from the perspective of the moon, and the moon is there to reflect, and reflections are inverted. So this is, you constantly have these, you have these inversions in the hierarchy. You have this tyrant who's more implicit. You have things that are not as straightforward because of that too. And so, but it still can be coherent. Anyway, that's what I have to say. I think it's funny. I think one of the things to add to this is that there's aspects of Christianity. So when we talk about like re-enchantment, we're thinking about re-enchanting the world for everybody in every culture. Problem with I run into, the biggest problem I run into when I talk about this concept, or I try to sell the idea of what I'm doing, is sadly it's in this kind of modern Western Christian world. And I've been trying to encourage Christians like to not think like that. The same world that kind of was like Harry Potter's the devil, and gargoyle shouldn't be on a Catholic church, and all these things. We know those. And then there was someone who posted today. It was like the perfect post for it. I wish I could find it again. Oh,
I was
let me
one
see.
of those kids in that family, though. I wasn't allowed to have the Harry Potter or the Lord of the Rings until, gosh, late high school, early college.
Yeah. So this is something I had to work past, because what I was doing in my work already and what felt right and powerful was not in the culture I was in. I was in kind of a Calvinistic circle that was a little like non-phenomenologically oriented. And I was doing this phenomenological storytelling, and it was causing a massive rift for me. But someone made this post. I won't say their name. It's a larger account. They said, Genesis is history, not mythology, not analogy, not allegory, not imagery, not poetry, history. And I was like, dude, you just explained disenchantment better than anybody I've seen in a long time. It's like, it's not merely any of those things, but it is, of course, all of those things. And I dare you to describe any of the ideas in it without using those other categories. And so that's someone who just threw out ontology. They threw out teleology. They threw out typology. They threw out all these great ologies that have been a wonderful part of making people wiser and have greater depth. And so the flat materialistic worldview goes for people who are in Western civilization who don't think of themselves as materialist, that they're engaging this the same way, and they're not going to escape it either, and they're going to fall woefully behind, where things are going if they don't change as well. So like, it's just funny because as we were talking about these things, I was thinking about things you were saying, Richard, and things Nicholas was saying, and I'm like, there's a whole sector of atheistic people that would be like, this is interesting. And there's a whole sector of Eastern Christians who are going to be like, duh. And then there's going to be this sector of this like kind of like materialistic Christian who doesn't realize that like they've lost the ability to see it this way, because they've literally told themselves it's wrong to experience the world in that way. And I think that's a terrible mistake.
It's interesting you say that, because there are sort of like two kinds of Christians that might let's say turn away from something like Queen of the Night. One would be like the monk on Athos, although most monks I have met would enjoy something like Queen of the Night, but let's say like the monk on Athos.
Zanfest. It was the largest Orthodox film festival in the world.
That's right, yeah. But let's say like the monk on Athos who's like, oh well, that's, they could be almost kind of like, well, that's cute. I mean, but like that person already lives in the enchanted world. Like it's just a living, vibrant reality for them constantly. Although that said,
they're right. The monk would be right.
Right.
I would agree with
right. And although even then, you've got things like, monasteries in Athos where, novices are required to read David Copperfield before anything else, because they got to learn how to repent before and be just like a decent human being before they can start being a good monk. But then the other kind of Christian would be the person who's at the opposite end of the spectrum. I was recently at an event, and the speaker before me was talking about a little bit about re-enchantment. We were talking about the works of George MacDonald, and the speaker before me is not Orthodox, but he was talking a little bit about this idea of re-enchantment, and specifically in the terminology that's laid out in Charles Taylor's The Secular Age, which is a very important book. It's only 800 pages. Everybody should read it twice. So he's talking about re-enchantment, and this man stands up who's a seminary professor at a large Protestant seminary, and said, well, isn't it better? And the way that he framed it was to say, well, biblical Christianity freed us from superstition. Of course, like obviously biblical Christianity means his kind of Christianity. That's what he means. But it's like it freed us from superstition. And so isn't it better that we don't have to live in this world where we have to worry about demons and things like this and that and the other thing? And of course, my first reaction is like, what Bible are you reading, dude? Like there's no biblical Christianity without, the reality of the unseen world. But I mean, his point was, isn't it nice that we're free of these things? And I was so, how do I say, energized by this, that mid, like, as I was getting ready to go up, I completely scrapped the talk that I had prepped, that I'd spent days writing, completely scrapped it and got up and just started talking about this question. And, not in a targeted way, but to say that, listen, part of the problem with the language of and this is why I use the term the sacramental imagination more, because part of the problem with when we're talking about enchantment and re-enchantment is that when we say re-enchantment, it sort of implies that you're not already enchanted, and yet you can look at our society and see that one of the things that has happened is that we're under this deep spell of sleep, right? This deep spell of blindness, this deep enchantment of sleep, where we're not awake to these realities. And you're exactly right. Like, the people who are waking up to these realities, but they don't have any kind of a structured way to or like an embodied way to meet them, those are the people who are getting sucked into psychedelics, and they're having what, in my opinion, are really real spiritual experiences and encounters. But it's not it's not healthy, right? Because there is obviously this dark side to re-enchantment. So all this to say, I think that, and I would probably like sort of try to cap off all the thoughts I've shared today with saying that you have to start by going to church, right? And you have to start by I mean, Peter Leithart, who is a famous Calvinist, a literary critic and theologian, et cetera, et cetera. He wrote this very provocative piece in First Things many years ago called "Why Protestants Can't Write." And I'm not trying to at my Protestant friends out there in the audience today.
Protestant friends, yeah.
Yeah, but his point was that the sort of Zwinglian rejection of the sacraments and the rejection of this idea that created things can become let's say can mediate grace, right? That we can come to know God through something created, right? So that the pinnacle of this being the Eucharist, but then for instance, in the theology of the icon, it also plays out in all these other ways, right? Mm-hmm. Where wood and paint can become a means of directing us towards God and become a way for us to know God and to know the saints. When you reject this, then the whole project of storytelling and myth making becomes extremely doubtful. Because there's very little justification for it. And what you end up with, what you always, and I'm not saying this is where everybody is, but the end result of that line of thinking is to say that only stories that preach, only stories that have an agenda, only stories that function as propaganda, that those are the only stories that are that actually matter. And it's really weird. Like, when I was growing up, this was what was happening in like the fundamentalist Christian circles that I grew up in. But now that I'm an adult, this is what is happening in kind of like it is kind of the liberal entertainment industry in general. But now the only thing that has changed is what they're preaching. But they accept this basic idea that, well, now if this story doesn't preach this certain set of values, which we want people to accept and we want people to adopt and agree with, and so if it doesn't, if this story isn't preaching this certain political and ideological framework, then it's not a good story, even if otherwise it's a perfectly good story, right? Yeah. And so this is the thing that I would say is that well, Flannery O'Connor said that the author who expects the writer to preach or the person who expects the writer to preach does not believe in the sacredness of the writer's calling. Yeah. Right. So your job as an artist, right, isn't to preach, but it is to reveal the world, right? It is to literally, it's to remember the world, right? To make it present again, to embody it again in a new way, in a fresh way, but ultimately in a way that's true. But that's not the same thing as preaching. And so what I would say is the most important thing that anybody can do who wants to tell stories in this way is immerse yourself to whatever capacity is available to you. Immerse yourself in a sacramental and an ascetic framework that's going to ground and discipline and sort of bridle in a useful way your creativity. Because otherwise, one of two things will happen. Either you'll go like full romantic, poet, right, like Byron and Shelley and those guys who produce some really beautiful works, but also many works that are not as beautiful because they don't participate in truth to the degree that they could have. So you either go that direction, or you'll go the direction of becoming a fundamentalist for whatever thing you're a fundamentalist about. you'll become a fundamentalist, and your work will just become a way for you to preach. And that's, I think we could all agree, that's something we want to avoid.
Yeah, you gave that in the perfect order too, because fundamentalism is a reactionary position to the first.
Right.
Right. It's
Right.
exactly what it is. It's because, let's just say you went back in time, you looked at what happened with art in the Western church and the cathedrals, and eventually it was, sensual statuary and naked Greek depictions of God on ceilings of buildings.
Right.
And you're like, oh, okay, the beauty, if you drop the asceticism, right? If you drop the asceticism, and when Richard's saying that, he's talking about the idea that there's like fasting, some kind of discipline, so you have dominion over
Right.
your own appetites in your body,
Right.
so that and then you fill your mind with the right things, you can engage way more beauty without it turning into sensuality. But
Right.
if you don't have asceticism and you look at what beauty does, you might throw out beauty. Like you might end up with blank churches with nothing but a plain wooden cross and a modern looking building that does nothing to inspire your soul except look professional. Maybe that's like the one thing. Oh, look, we look credible. Like that's all you're left with. And so and you have to avoid it because it will create sensuality if you don't have these embodied disciplines. And so I think that's one of the important things about art is understanding it that way, is that like, yeah, you want to be able to go out on the limb and encounter as much beauty and use your imagination without falling over the edge, because you can pull in bad things for your imagination and things that no one ought to present to someone else and too as well. So I think I think you just nailed it right there. And you nailed, I think, partially why you're kind of a contradiction as a person, in the sense that you can have these romantic poetic thoughts, fully pursue them, and not go off the deep end, and still maintain structure as a father and as an author and as a coworker for your employees. So there you go. You can just put that on your obituary one day.
Well, guys,
Thank you so much, Neil.
Yeah. We're almost 2 hours in. I don't know if there's anything else you want to unfold, or if that's a good place.
No, we hijacked it on you. Like you gave us
did.
to talk to each other.
I invited you to.
I know.
That's what this was.
Yeah.
I could have called Neil and Nicholas and you, Derek. Like I could have just called you guys on the phone, and we would have had an identical conversation.
That's true. Derek and I talked last week for a while.
Well, that's what prompted this was really, it's like
a
2-hour, just like beautiful conversation, right? So helpful in so many ways. Thanks for that, Neil. But then I was left with it. I was like, man, I almost feel bad. That I can't share this in some way, So then he was like, oh, well, okay, I want to talk with these guys. I really look up to them. We've talked or collaborated in different ways, and let's do it in a way that we can, share it. So that way, other people that are possibly in my position, just getting into this, or maybe they're, at your position and just kind of need like that remembering or renewal of purpose, let's say, that they could really value from that.
Yeah, I learned from this too. I mean, I learned from listening to these guys. I thought it was really helpful for me too.
I know, as soon as he mentioned Kickstarter, you're like, ooh, okay.
Well, I want to do Kickstarter next year. So.
Yeah. Well, listen,
like
we're all going to get a bunch of experience about that, and hopefully just get better and better at it. This is the direction we got to go in moving forward, I think. So.
Yeah, and hopefully everybody gets behind us on these things too.
Yeah.
If they trust us, if they don't trust us, by all means, keep your money in your pocket.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, this is
not gonna coerce it.
The nice thing is, thanks to conversations like this, like we can complain sometimes about how like meta the conversation gets, like especially in the sort of like the meaning crisis, web sphere, right? Sometimes it's like, oh, we're having a conversation about the conversation.
Oh, yeah.
And now I'm having a conversation about that, so that's 3 layers, right? But but for all that, one of the great things that has come out of this conversation is that people know who Neil is. People have a sense of who I am, right? It's people who know who you are, so they can sort of say, okay, this is this person, this is what their deal is. I hope that even if people don't agree with everything I have to say, they will at the same time they'll sort of say, okay, but I know where Richard's coming from now, and I know where Neil is coming from now, and I could sort of like, I can trust the things that they're doing, right? So
okay, well, I do have one more private thing to mention to you guys, so I'll go ahead and stop the recording now.
Later, general public, you don't get to hear it.
That's right, you guys suck. No, I'm kidding, but yeah, thanks very much.
All right, guys.